Welcome to Casual Politics, Peter Hitchens. First of all, thank you.
How casual is that?
Yes, there you are. What else do we need today? And but thank you very much for accepting my request. You need no introduction. You've been active in the daily political life in Britain for almost 30 years, is that right?
Well, I don't know whether
years.
you'd call it active in political life. I mean,
Yeah.
I have not engaged in formal party politics for most of that time, and I've given it up entirely now.
And now you're a columnist for Mail on Sunday, but also you write books, and you make some appearance on the BBC as well on Sunday mornings. So now let's first...
Sometimes even on other days.
Yes, there you are. Why not? Probably one day on Strictly, we will see you on Strictly.
I don't think I
You're not
have the
tempted,
body for it. I don't think they're tempted, more to the point.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, on Fidel Castro, so I know that you wrote a great deal about him and you criticised him, so what do you make of his death?
It's only that there are still people in the Western world who ought to know better who continue to make excuses for him. And I think that's the most interesting thing about him. He is a petty military dictator of a small country, but for some peculiar reason he's become a hero to a certain kind of person. And that is the interesting thing, that these people who would consider themselves to be radicals, Democrats, liberal-minded, tolerant, find themselves making excuses for a man who, for instance, put homosexuals in labour camps, tortured his opponents, made them eat their own excrement and indeed other people's, and ran one of the most tightly controlled totalitarian states in human history. And yet they make excuses for him, saying he had a good health service and his education system was good, which are questionable claims because his society having been almost totally closed, it was impossible for anyone to check them.
What do you make of Jeremy Corbyn? Jeremy Corbyn's tributes to him?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn is a naive person in these matters, I think, more than anything else. As of so many 60s radicals, which Jeremy Corbyn is, and I used to be, are, they have romantic fantasies about these things. I really do think that if he wants to be the leader of a major political party in a Western country, he's going to have to get the idea that Castro was not somebody for whom anything complimentary can be said. He will have to understand that this was, as I say, an unpleasant dictator who killed and tortured his opponents.
But like some dictators, what he did, he exported his ideas to other continents.
Well, he didn't export his own ideas. He was, in most cases, a front for the Soviet Union and its operations. So particularly the Angolan intervention was done with the approval of the Soviet Union, and it served their foreign policy. There were no ideas to be exported. He didn't have any ideas. He knew nothing about economics, very little about politics.
But in the 1980s, some of the right-wing press would actually praise Pinochet for his actions, and on the other side, they would criticize Castro for.
Well, they shouldn't have done that. Pinochet was obviously a military dictator who'd come to power through an illegitimate coup against an elected government, and there is no excuse for that, and people shouldn't go around defending it. But likewise, they shouldn't go around defending his equivalent, Castro, on the other side.
And do you think that Castro's death, it marks the end of an era?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think radical delusion will continue till the end of time. I don't know what other era there is. It marks the end of his life. That's what it marks the end of. But interestingly, here's another thing. The Castro regime is hereditary, but sideways. His job has been inherited by his brother, who was obviously, of course, the most qualified to inherit it, in a system where there's only one free man in the country. Well, not even really one party. It's a compliment to the Cuban Communist Party. Of course, a party is just an organisation for maintaining the Castro regime in power.
But these people, they made a change actually through photographs at the time, whereas today we, like some people like Trump, they use actually other means such as the social media. Does that signify something about these people, whether it was Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and then when you...
I don't really understand the question.
Because actually they were revolutionary figures, and they had they would
were they?
Communicate
they were people who'd taken to political violence. Whether that makes them revolutionaries is another question altogether. One of the interesting things about the Castro revolution is that it really began when the United States withdrew support from Fulgencio Batista, which did sometime before Castro came to power. the United States first of all cut off arms supplies to Batista, and secondly the US ambassador told Batista he would have to go. The United States were not expecting Castro to take over, I don't think. They were expecting someone like Urrutia to take over, but whoever took over, they were expecting a different sort of Cuban, semi-despotic person with at least a front of democratic legitimacy to take over from Batista, and they got Castro. So his revolution was largely achieved by the intervention of the United States. It's a paradox which most people aren't aware of. Castro, had the United States continued to support Batista, Castro would probably never have come to power or been heard of much. But it's precisely because the United States withdrew its crucial support that Batista's regime came to an end.
So what's next for Cuba?
I don't know. And the thing about Cuba now is that thanks to Barack Obama's very sensible, if I may say, decision to end the embargo, the future of Cuba
would it be unraveled with Trump's
I doubt it very much. It's probably impossible to reverse now, and most of Trump's noisier election promises have turned out to be untrue. And I would see very little advantage to him in ending that, because apart from anything else, a lot of the Cuban exiles are quite anxious to get back home. And the best way of bringing the Castro regime to an end is opening its frontiers as much as possible to foreign investment and outsiders, so that it becomes increasingly ridiculous that this immensely decrepit, failed regime continues to sit in power in Nevada. I think it will eventually die because the world around it will make it look increasingly ridiculous and ineffectual, and they can't go on forever. Exactly what form it would take, I wouldn't dare to predict, but I just think that the Castro regime is effectively at an end, and now that Castro himself is dead and the embargo is gone, and travel between the two countries is relatively free and investment will become easier, I think that while the government may conceivably survive, it will survive in the midst of an economy and a society which largely ignores it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think will Cuba open up to the West?
Open up to the world, and of course it will lose certain things in this, because any visitor to Cuba would feel a twinge of nostalgia to see children playing in the street in an old-fashioned way. But that wasn't because they necessarily wanted not to have all the electronic knickknacks that children have. That's because they couldn't get them. Now they can get them, they will. Cuba will change. It will become much more like everywhere else, and some things will undoubtedly be lost in that. But that's an accidental byproduct of it having been a closed totalitarian regime. No doubt some things will be lost when the North Korean regime eventually collapses too. But I'm afraid that's in a way just too bad. And
now about the French presidential election, now we've got a Republican candidate called François Fillon, who will probably face off Marine Le Pen at the next year's presidential election. What do you make of it?
Well, I don't know very much more about François Fillon than anybody else does. Everyone's fascinated here about the fact that he has a British, Welsh, in fact, wife, although apparently she refers to herself as English, coming from Abergavenny, which is quite close to the border. I don't know.
Is it the best person?
What I find really irritating is when people refer to French politicians as Thatcherite.
Yeah.
There is no possibility of Thatcherism in France. France was, under de Gaulle and afterwards, and under Giscard as well, for goodness sake, and under Pompidou, was far, far more of a socialist country in terms of its economy than Britain ever was. It's a country fundamentally more left-wing than Britain is.
But Britain was the same in the 1970s.
No, Britain was never
sick man of Europe, wasn't it?
Well, it might have been sick, but it was never as statist as France was. And it's a different kind of country and a different culture. And the French Revolution genuinely did shift French political culture and French economic management way to the left. Even if I thought that Thatcherism was a particularly good idea, which I don't think François Fillon either wants to impose it or would be able to in French politics. And the president isn't that all-powerful.
And then
and that's always assuming that he wins. Who are we to say how the presidential election will go? Who are we to say whether the French left will find a better candidate than Hollande, which they might do? Who is to say that Marine Le Pen will not this time make the breakthrough that she's been threatening to make for so long? It's too early to tell.
But is it the right person to fight off Marine Le Pen?
I don't know. You only find out when he fights her. And I simply don't know. I don't know enough about it. It's all very well running a primary against Sarkozy and Juppé, but a wholly different thing fighting against Marine Le Pen. I mean, my own guess would be that if the economy doesn't get seriously worse, that the Front National will be limited pretty much to its normal level of support, which can't win a second round. But I could be wrong about that, because everyone's been wrong about so many elections lately, and so many polls have been wrong, that it seems to be unwise to presume. Rule nothing out.
Because the French...
very much my rule at the moment.
Because the French will play a crucial part, actually, in our negotiations, Theresa May's negotiations. And the last time I saw François Fillon, I asked him, I said, if you become the president, regardless of our access to the single market, would you still do free trade with us? And he said, of course I will do, because actually Britain, it's one of the biggest markets in Europe and in the world on its own.
There are so many complexities in this, and the single market is not about. It's not really about tariffs. The single market is about the bureaucratic obstacles which you can erect to trade you don't want.
And free movement of people.
Well, free movement of people is negotiable to some extent if Britain became, which I think is the most likely outcome, a member of the European Economic Area instead of the European Union. So the free movement would persist, but there would be reservations to it which could be implemented. The truth is, much of the mass immigration which people were worried about in Britain, which made the vote happen as it did, has now taken place irreversibly, I think. And I don't think that people have quite cottoned on to just how much of the things that they voted against have already irreversibly happened.
And you've been a staunch critic of Tony Blair's government and Tony Blair himself, and now he is interfering and he's asking for a second referendum.
But he's a joke figure. I don't think.
But some
I don't
MPs,
think he really understands.
Seriously.
Well, I don't know who they are. I don't
Nick
know.
Clegg and Chukwamuna.
Well, there you are. Then.
From Open.
But I don't think that as long as there is any semblance of public opinion in this country, I don't think that Mr. Blair is going to make a comeback. Also, if he went back into electoral politics, he'd have to start declaring his interests again. People could then see into all the details of the Blair Foundation, which he doesn't seem to want anybody to know much about. I don't see that happening. I think it's just a bit of a laugh for everybody.
But do you think that Parliament will actually block triggering Article 50? Or?
I don't think that's the point. I mean, if I were negotiating this, which thank heaven I'm not, I wouldn't be rushing. I certainly wouldn't be rushing to trigger Article 50, because Article 50 immediately places the initiative in the hands of the other side. I would do immensely long and complicated exploratory negotiations before triggering anything. I don't think it would be at all wise to have an unbreachable deadline and to exclude myself from any further discussion by triggering Article 50. I don't know why people are so keen on it. I think the main reason why a lot of people who voted leave, which I did not do, I didn't vote at all, are so keen on Article 50 is because they're scared that the government doesn't really intend to leave the European Union. I think they have to understand that the government, however much it doesn't want to leave the European Union, does feel committed by the result of the referendum and will in some way or other leave the European Union. But my own view, which has been now for some time, is that having been half in the European Union before the referendum, we'll end up half out of it afterwards. But we will not get entirely out of it. It's probably physically impossible to do so in the time available. Leaving the European Union was always going to be, which I favour, was always going to be a very long project, something you couldn't just do overnight. An elected government with that as its settled policy, which it actually agreed with, would have plenty of time to achieve it. It might take 10, 15, even 20 years to unravel all the ties we have to the European Union. Such a government could do it, but a government which doesn't really believe in it, which has a very short lifespan ahead of it and has many other worries, has a different attitude towards it, and that's why I think it will probably in the end go for the only off-the-peg arrangement which would work, which is EEA membership.
And if we have Nigel Farage as our ambassador to the US...
Oh, I think people should stop. Does anyone in Britain begin to have any idea how little the United States cares about this country?
But
this
Trump
is the thing, whenever I see all this stuff...
isn't he?
Is he? I have no idea. Americans may have very sentimental views about Scotland or Ireland or England or wherever it is, but it doesn't matter. The interests of the United States have for many, many decades, probably more than a century, been wholly different from those of Britain, and where they differ from those of Britain, the United States will prefer its own interest. This ridiculous shoulder-to-shoulder sentimental special relationship rubbish, we really ought to grow up and cast it to one side. They don't particularly love us. And there was a speech that Woodrow Wilson made when he came here after the First World War, saying, we're not your cousins. We may speak the same language, but we simply are not. Stop acting as if we were. And Wilson was absolutely determined, actually, to topple us from our position, particularly in naval supremacy, and believed very strongly that that should happen. The United States does not have common interest with the United Kingdom much of the time, and when it doesn't have common interest with us, it acts quite sensibly, as it should, according to its interests, not ours. There's no love there. There's no sentimentality. Most Americans don't know where we are. People should stop these fantasies about how much they care about us. The special relationship does not exist. It is a fantasy.
And what about our own government? Do they fight for our national interests or not?
Well, it depends what they perceive them to be, but I think that the difficulty has been that since the late 1950s and after the Suez catastrophe, a lot of British politicians believed that we had no future as an independent country and therefore sought our absorption into the European Union and to try and find a new equivalent to our previous position by being members of the European Union and therefore being some sort of at least regional, if not world power by proxy indirectly. I personally think that was a mistake, but you can see how their minds worked. Suez was a great blow to their self-confidence.
Mm.
But as I say, I think it was a mistake. I think we should recognise that we are now a medium-sized country of some importance with a great, which used to have, I don't know whether it still does have, a great legacy on which you could build a great deal. And it could still function as an independent country in its own right, and I would have preferred that. But whether it's now too late to recover our independence, I do begin to wonder.
Mm. And in the light of Philip Hammond's autumn statement, or beyond, they forecast that economically will be worse off in the next 6 months.
Well, I would have thought
how accurate are they?
Who knows? Economic forecasts are probably less accurate than weather forecasts, and they're generally made out of some sort of interest or other. I've had no idea. What is plain from the figures about our present economic state is that we are in deep economic trouble. Mm. Our current account deficit, which is the really serious figure, is extremely bad, the worst I think in peacetime history. Our trade deficit, even with invisibles taken into account, is now appalling. The level of personal debt is colossal. The level of government debt is not as serious as the level of personal debt, but in fact it is irresponsibly high. There's no possibility of them ever beginning to get it under control without a serious bout of inflation, which seems to me to be the most likely thing to happen. I think the devaluation of the pound, which was triggered by the referendum, was probably the first sign of a devaluation which is by no means over. I think the pound will fall further. Mm. And when it does, the consequences will be quite serious. Anything which is denominated in dollars, which is quite a lot of commodities, will become extremely expensive, which although devaluation generally benefits a manufacturing economy, we haven't got much of that. But it doesn't necessarily benefit an importing economy. We will find a lot of the things we need to import will be very much more expensive and standard of living will fall. But that's nothing to do with leaving the European Union. That was going to happen anyway. The markets decided to move on the referendum because it was a convenient moment to do it, but all of it was predictable and indeed predicted by me long before the referendum, indeed long before the referendum was even suggested. Mm.
And what about the cuts to the welfare state? Do you think those disabled people would they be worse off?
I don't know. I have absolutely no expertise on the welfare state. The trouble with all welfare states is that any centralised attempt to get them under control will invariably do collateral damage to deserving people. Welfare states are so vast and so complicated and so bureaucratic that you would require a mind like a supercomputer to avoid that kind of collateral damage. So people will always suffer, and the trouble also with welfare states is that people who are prepared, cynical people who are prepared to milk them, often don't get caught in these cuts. So it's all part of a terrible unfairness. I have no solution. But we are getting poorer, and what happens to welfare states and countries which get poorer is they gradually shrivel away, and no one ever has the courage to say we can't do this anymore. The payments are still made, but inflation particularly wears them away to the extent where they no longer really exist. That's what happened to the old Soviet welfare welfare system, and I think it's what will happen to her.
Mm. And as someone who wrote about David Cameron in the past, what do you make of his legacy?
But does he have a legacy?
The welfare state.
I don't believe he has. I think he was probably one of the most forgettable prime ministers we've ever had. His only contribution was to promise a referendum, which he never intended to have, and then lose it.
For party political reasons?
Oh, all referenda in British history have proposed to save one political party or another. Harold Wilson's referendum was designed to save the Labour Party.
It didn't.
Well, in the long run, it didn't. And David Cameron's was designed to save the Tory Party. Well, we'll see. Too early to tell.
But Harold Wilson, he was much more successful because he took a backseat drive rather than David Cameron, who was very active.
Harold Wilson was just fortunate in his time. People didn't at that stage understand the European Union. Most people still don't. But the thing which the British electorate understood in June of this year was the connection between European Union membership and our loss of control over our borders. And since they cared enormously about mass immigration, they put the two things together, and the vote on the European Union became, for a very large number of people, a vote on immigration. And they voted against immigration. That issue was simply not around during Harold Wilson's referendum. Had it been, it would have gone the same way.
And Britain now is the fastest growing economy in Europe and the second largest economy the fifth largest economy in the world. Don't you think that
we used to say things like that about East Germany, didn't they? But it wasn't really,
a great deal to David
true.
Cameron's premiership over the last 5 years.
Yeah, the fastest growing is always one of those statistics which doesn't really mean anything. Growing from what to what? What you need to know is not how fast it's growing, but what
more
the
people are in
figures
work than before.
Well,
5
allegedly,
years ago.
but do you actually believe? Are you one of those people who believes government statistics?
But
do
they're
you,
independent.
do you believe government statistics?
But they're independent. They're not. They're
Well,
independent.
it's a simple rule of life, isn't it? All politically sensitive statistics are fiddled. And to say that people are employed when they are technically self-employed but not actually doing anything very much seems to me to be untrue. And to say people have gone off the unemployment register because they're officially registered as disabled or whatever it is, when in fact they're really unemployed, it's a fiddle. And to say that we've imported a huge amount of cheap labour while 1 million NEETs, not in employment, education or training, young people born here don't do anything economically productive, doesn't seem to me to be something to boast about. Why are we importing cheap labour instead of training and educating our own young people to do jobs? I don't think the British economy is in any kind of creditable state. I think it's if it were a company, it would be bankrupt.
The last question on Brexit. Do you see a parallel between Brexit and Trump's victory?
No.
No, there was no.
I think people are too anxious to make. I think the United States is a completely different society from Britain in so many ways. And there are parallels between anything. If you look for them, you can go through the Bible and look at the chapter numbers and discover from them that the world's going to end next year if you want to. But you've already made the pattern in your head and are applying it. The truth is that there is no real similarity between British and American politics.
Not in any way at all.
Not really. Not as educational or important or informative or helps you understand what's going on in either country. No, I don't think so.
And
it's just tedious games playing. If you want to understand the United States, don't imagine it's a big Britain. And if you want to understand Britain, don't imagine it's a small USA. It's not.
And do you believe in the Scottish independence? Because now
I believe in it. I think it will take place, but it won't be independence. The only sort of independence that Scotland can attain is independence within Europe, which Jim Sillars realised a long time ago, which means basically transferring Scottish fealty from London to Brussels. I can't read the future. Before the EU referendum, I would have said that it was pretty much inevitable, and also before the oil price fell, that Scotland would break away from the United Kingdom probably within 20 years. Now I'm not so sure. I thought, and said at the time of the Scottish referendum, that constantly bullying the Scots and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, and tried to frighten them into voting to stay in the European Union, it wouldn't work. And I think I was right. I would have said the same thing about the behaviour of the British people in the EU referendum. All that bullying and fear probably increased the vote to leave. But I don't know, I can't. The future is so full of imponderables, but I don't think it's by any means impossible that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom. I think a much more pressing problem is what's going to happen to Northern Ireland.
So we will have some constitutional crisis?
We're in a constitutional crisis. We have one now. We have a clash between two rival democratic mandates of an elected parliament and a referendum.
But the free travel area between the Irish borders, they've been in place since Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister back in 1922. So
except it's not really, it doesn't operate as it used to. For instance, I used to be able to travel to Ireland without a passport. Now you try arriving at Dublin Airport from Britain without a passport and see where it gets you. It doesn't operate as anything like as freely as it used to. And there were British plans to implement a system whereby Irish citizens had to show passports at Heathrow, as I understand, which weren't implemented. Whereas you can travel freely between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, because the Republic of Ireland won't impose a border there, because that would be an admission of what it still regards as an illegitimate partition, so it simply won't do it. If you travel from the Irish Republic to Northern Ireland, there's no trace of a border on the Irish side at all. The end result of it must be, it seems to me, the only hard border you could implement there would be one between the island of Ireland and the other one of the major British Isles, which means that there will be travel restrictions between Northern Ireland and England and Scotland. That's going to cause a problem, but it will be the only practical way in which it can be done.
And do you think that the people, are they aware of the problems that we're facing now enough by the media? Or are they enough informed by the media?
I think the referendum was a shockingly badly conducted thing, and those who led both sides were extremely crude in their campaigning and didn't really ever discuss the issues that they were pursuing properly. In some cases, I think were wholly committed to the sides they took. I think that many people on the Leave side were people I would not have imagined a year before were in favour of leaving the European Union. I'm still not sure that they were. And those who wanted to stay didn't seem to have any other argument than if you leave, the sky will fall. It was pathetic. But as I say, I never wanted a referendum. I don't like referenda. I think they're unconstitutional, and they generally lower the level of discourse.
And as one of the biggest contributors to the NATO, do we have enough strategy to fight ISIS in Aleppo? And
you said NATO?
Yes.
What's NATO got to do with it? I mean, this is why is one of the points where I'm very much with Donald Trump is I have no idea why NATO still exists. NATO was an organisation formed to oppose Soviet expansion through the Warsaw Pact into Western Europe, a threat which vanished.
How could we fight ISIS
in 1990?
If we can't do it?
Well, I don't know. How do you fight terror organisations? Certainly not with military. Is NATO involved in fighting ISIS? I don't know. You certainly don't fight ISIS by backing very similar people in attempts to overthrow the Syrian government.
But Donald Trump, he doesn't say that we need to get rid of NATO. What he's saying is that the NATO members, they're not contributing enough.
I think he has
to the budget.
I think he has said things. No, I think he has said things critical of NATO in general. It's also true. But
the budget.
I think he has said things critical of NATO's existence in general, actually. But I'd have to check that. But the budget thing, well, it's never going to change. Most NATO members will never contribute any more than they do now to the NATO budget. And you can whistle for it if you want to. They never have, they never will. NATO as an organisation was always heavily based upon the United States, on Germany and on Britain. France's involvement was always tangential. For a lot of the time, France wouldn't even belong to its military command. The other countries didn't really have any serious contribution. Do you know what the only item of equipment that NATO could ever agree on as a common design and size was? The NATO sick bag for use in airplanes. It's the only thing they ever coordinated. It was an alliance led by the Americans and kept going in terms of land forces led by American and German troops, to a lesser extent British ones, and actually it was a bluff.
So how could we build a coalition if it's not through NATO?
I have no idea. I'm not by any means sure that this supposed Islamic State is as big a threat as people make it out to be, and I'm also not at all sure that it can be combated by straightforward military power. And the whole mess in the Middle East is the product of heavy military intervention in Iraq by the George Bush and the Blair government here. They created effectively the conditions in which the Islamic State was founded, and it seems to me that we should be careful about any further intervention in this area, having seen so many unintended consequences from the intervention we've already had.
And on a more cheerful topic, what do you make of Ed Balls' performance?
I think it may make him the next Prime Minister with 3.
Would it be?
It's possible. And the time was when activities of that kind were ruled you out of mainstream politics.
Yeah.
Because it would have been seen as you would have lost in some way the necessary intellectual and personal prestige by publicly humiliating yourself in a way, which is what you did. But now it's not so. We have a different culture. I mean, I've for a long time had quite a high opinion of Ed Balls as a politician. I don't agree with him, but I think he has 2 things to his credit. One, he has a much greater sense of humour than most people are credited with. People do not understand that. And the other is that he was one of those who saved the pound. So I regretted, simply from the point of view that a major figure had been removed from politics, I regretted his loss of his seat at the last election. I thought it was a pity. But I think that the end possibility of this may well be that he becomes the leader of the Labour Party. After all, Boris Johnson's political career is almost entirely founded on his appearances on Have I Got News For You.
Yeah.
If he had not been taken up as a regular panellist by Have I Got News For You, he would not now be Foreign Secretary. He probably wouldn't even be a member of Parliament. Television can make people. If they're the right sort of person, if they're properly telegenic,
Especially
if they don't mind being prepared to be laughed at a bit, if they can show that, then they can become important in politics.
Do you think that's a problem with our politics, and especially?
Of course it is. We have a terribly debated culture, but there it is. I mean, there's no point in pretending that it isn't so. And in the case of Ed Balls, oddly enough, he does have. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he does at least have a considerable mind.
Mm. And were you surprised to see him? He got through like.
I'm not surprised by anything really, but I don't. It's not the sort of thing I watch. I did actually watch on the iPlayer the Great Balls of Fire episode when he was lowered from the ceiling on a flaming piano, because I felt I ought to have seen it.
What about the Gango style?
No, I'm not that interested. I don't watch much television.
Yeah.
Not oddly enough because I don't want to. There are many evenings when I would quite like to turn away from reading and writing and just watch something that would be moderately entertaining. But there's almost never anything on that I can bear to watch for more than about 30 seconds before I just want to turn it off.
For sure.
I just feel like it's not for me.
No, but do you think that there is a connection between satire and the public? Like, people like Boris Johnson or even Ed Balls, when they try to be funny, and then people, they accept them more than they accept them as politicians. Look at Boris Johnson now, he's become very unpopular.
I have no idea. I don't know I simply don't know how it works. It wouldn't have worked for everybody. It worked for
Michael Portillo and his trains.
It worked for them. Well, I don't know. Again, Michael Portillo and his trains was a creation of broadcasting. I've always resented that because I tend to think I know rather more about trains than Michael Portillo, and I have been keener on them for much longer, but he got the gig. But maybe if someone had offered me that, I'd now be more popular than I am. But broadcasting is a strange lottery in which some people get it, some people. I did actually appear once on Have I Got News For You myself. I would be the first to say that I was no Boris Johnson, though they did actually cut out one of my perfectly good jokes. Because as you know, it's recorded.
What was it?
Not like it's a long time ago. I can't remember.
Back in 2004, wasn't it?
I can't even remember the date, but it was a long time ago. But the interesting fact was, for about 2 weeks afterwards, I had an inkling of what real celebrity would be like. I was recognised in the street by people who would never normally have known who I was, and faded very fast. But if I'd got that on a regular basis, I might now be Prime Minister. The power of it is extraordinary.
It is, absolutely.
And it's completely capricious, who gets it and who doesn't.
And two last questions. The government, they've been under fire for spending some of the public money, actually part of the public money on Buckingham Palace renovations. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't see any particular problem. The huge estates of the Crown were long ago given in effect to the British state, and the income from them goes to the British state, in return for which the British state agreed to support the royal family. Buckingham Palace is not a home. Buckingham Palace is a ceremonial building where heads of state are welcomed and ceremonies take place, such as investitures, which the royal family don't particularly like it. They don't like living there. It hasn't, for what I view as rather shameful reasons, been properly repaired for a very long time. People, again, there was a sort of spiteful Republican desire to remove the royal yacht at the end of the major era, which actually I think took effect in the Blair era. Again, as if the royal yacht was there for the personal pleasure of the royal family, like like a businessman's yacht. It never was, and once it was gone, people realised what an extraordinarily useful diplomatic and commercial tool it had been. That's what the royal family is. As Prince Philip once said, people really must get out of their heads the idea that the monarchy exists at the expense of the people for the benefit of the monarchy. It's actually, it exists for the benefit of the people and the country. Particularly the current monarch and her consort devote their lives to doing things they probably don't much want to do for the general good, and are not particularly lavishly rewarded for it, nor do they live, as far as we know or can discover, lives as luxurious as that perhaps lived by the late Fidel Castro.
And the last question, what's next for Peter Hitchens? Are you writing?
Well, I have a book which I'm contracted to write, which I've begun to write.
What is it about?
Well, it's about the strange religion that we've made out of the Second World War, and it's called the phony victory, because so many modern wars, particularly the Iraq War, are summoned up and sold to the public on the basis that they're like the Second World War. It's always autumn 1938. It's always Munich. The political leader who wants war always thinks he is Churchill. The people who oppose war are always told they're appeasers and Neville Chamberlain. The enemy is always Hitler. And this pattern is so phony that not only was it phony in reference to Iraq, which it was, and not only was it phony in reference to Suez, because Anthony Eden compared Nasser to Hitler as well, it was phony at the time. The Second World War was not the idealistic good war that it's been portrayed. It was much more complicated than that. And so a certain amount of revision about the history of how that war came into existence and how very, very damaging it was to this country when it came to be fought as it was fought. The difficulty here is that if you make any kind of criticism of it, it's almost a national religion. The Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, our finest hour. The moment you start suggesting it wasn't as portrayed, people start saying, oh, well, you think Hitler should have won then, or we should have given in to Hitler, or some rubbish like that. These are not things that I think. Or, in fact, in many cases, they're the opposite of what I think. What I do think is that it was a very peculiar moment at which to choose to go to war, to actually embark on a continental war against a heavily armed and well-prepared military power when your army was still drilling with broomsticks on Salisbury Plain because it had no weapons, and when your air force was mainly equipped with biplanes, does seem to me to be a little bit unwise. That's one element of it, and also the idealistic claims made for it, the idea that we went to war to save the Jews of Europe from mass murder. Well, we didn't. That wasn't our purpose in going to war, and if it had been, we didn't achieve it. So there's a fantasy about it. It's time people kicked it, and the people who fought in it for the most part, and these included my father, who underwent a great deal of hardship in the Second World War, they are mostly gone from us now, and I think it's legitimate for us, and I respect immensely their own personal courage and sacrifice. I think it's legitimate for us now to examine it again.
But what were the values that they were fighting for?
We were fighting for any values. And we went to war for the reason why Britain and France declared war on Germany was to protect the independence of Poland, a country which had shortly before that taken part in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and which was profoundly anti-Semitic and very far from democratic. So I'm not quite sure what values we were fighting for in that case.
So do we understand enough about those values as a nation or not?
Well, I don't know why you keep mentioning values. We didn't go to war for values. We went to war because we were afraid of ceasing to be a world power. And as a result of going to war, we ceased to be a world power.
Yeah.
So our main purpose in going to war was one in which we utterly failed.
Do you have the date of your book? Do you know when?
Well, I'm supposed to deliver the manuscript by September next year, so I better get on with it.
So we should wait and see. But thank you very much, Peter Hitchens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.